Hi, everyone, and welcome back to A Book Nerd and the Bible. My name is Sam, and each week I compare some of my all-time favorite books to biblical stories to see what we can learn about both. In our show's inaugural season, we are focusing on Jesus before he starts his ministry and the origin stories of some of our favorite characters. Today is the final episode in our three-part series about the Lord of the Rings. This week we are going to be examining Jesus' call to his first four disciples and Frodo Baggins' decision to bring along three hobbits named Merry, Pippin, and Sam Gamgee in his epic quest to destroy the Ring of Power. I think this is going to be a great conclusion to the series, and I was really surprised when I started researching this episode how easily these groups of four can be compared. If you haven't heard the first two episodes in this series, then I hope you'll go back and listen to those, but you should still be able to keep up today. I have to really thank all of you listening again this week. We were once again on the Good Pods top charts for book podcast. Good Pods is a great platform for listening to this show and finding others that are similar. So check it out if you haven't got the chance and help us stay on top. This is really humbling to me, and it means a lot to me that anyone would take time out of their day to listen to these stories. I have learned so much just in the first 5 episodes of this podcast, and I am working hard to make the show better and better each week. So I really appreciate the listens, and I am doing my best to make sure I have a good quality show for you each time. The last thing before we begin our discussion is the obligatory warning that I will likely be discussing things that happen later in the Lord of the Rings series. So if you haven't read the books and you want to avoid spoilers, then I recommend stopping here. I respect your decision to wait 60 years to start the series, but I think you probably already know the ending. So why don't you just join us for today? With that said, let's head over to the Shire and the Sea of Galilee and dive in. We often have this image that Galilee, the area of Judea that Jesus came from, is a backwards, isolated area that would have been filled with illiterate farmers. This probably wasn't the case. Galilee is a very beautiful area that is divided into two sections, Upper and Lower Galilee. Upper Galilee is hilly and not very well populated at the time Jesus lived there. Lower Galilee has these sort of gentle rolling hills, and it touches the Sea of Galilee, which is truthfully more of a large freshwater lake than a true sea. Historically, the area was caught between a number of different powerful countries, so people settled mostly on hilltops that could be easily fortified if they were attacked. This started to change about 40 years before Jesus' birth, when the powerful Roman Empire placed their chosen family, the family of Herod the Great from episode 1 and his sons, in charge of Judea. The relative peace in the region, brought on by the intervention of an empire as strong as Rome, led to a population boom around the Sea of Galilee. Galilee would have been a very interesting place during Jesus' lifetime. The influx of trading routes led to Galilee experiencing a strong influence from Greece and Rome. Many cities by the sea spoke Greek in addition to Aramaic and Hebrew, something not seen in other parts of Judea and Israel at this time. The Herodian rulers were also building new cities with Roman features like aqueducts, grid-patterned streets, and potentially a large theater. However, most researchers agree that while a Greco-Roman veneer might have been placed in these towns, Galilee remained mostly culturally Jewish. In simpler words, Galilee had a Jewish culture in flux as outside forces crept closer. And the culture wasn't the only thing changing. Demographically, individuals began to move from small hilltop villages to large lakeside towns. The population boom I mentioned earlier, well, it caused a surplus of workers in these small villages. So it's likely that the population of young men in Galilee were fairly mobile and moved throughout the region for jobs. Or, as we'll see in our story, to follow messiahs. One of the recipients of this population boom was a small fishing village on the Sea of Galilee named Capernaum. Only a 45-minute drive in a car today, Capernaum would have been about a day's walk away from Jesus' hometown of Nazareth. The Romans were beginning to see Galilee as an important linchpin between the western and eastern parts of the empire, and the Sea of Galilee acted as a maritime railroad for transporting supplies and goods across the empire. Capernaum's job opportunities grew with Roman investment and began to attract a lot of young men to the area looking for work. The city began to have a thriving fishing trade, and it would not be uncommon for young men to leave their families for jobs aboard the boats of Capernaum. Capernaum is the backdrop of our story today, but it is also the headquarters of Jesus' ministry after calling the disciples. We can see it as a thriving, merchant-minded town where worlds were colliding every day. Hopefully, this gives us a little context for the biblical story we are going to be looking at today. Jesus' first call to disciples is found in every gospel in slightly different formats. I'm going to be using the Gospel of Mark's account of the event. Mark is the earliest written gospel of the four, and it was likely intended for Gentile converts. Chapter 1, verses 16 through 20 state, "As Jesus walked beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and his brother Andrew casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. 'Come and follow me,' Jesus said, 'and I will send you out to fish for people.' At once they left their nets and followed him. When he had gone a little farther, he saw James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John in a boat preparing their nets. Without delay he called them, and they left their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired men and followed him." I know what you're thinking. Boy, that escalated quickly. A random holy man walks by a bunch of fishermen, commands them to follow, and in my mind they just drop like a bunch of expensive lures and nets and hop off on an adventure. It is one of the most dramatic scenes in the New Testament, and it is really easy to see why this would capture the attention of any reader. Many Christians have been struck by the abruptness of Jesus' call, but we have a few hints that this is not the first meeting between Jesus and his first four disciples. The most obvious one comes from the Gospel of John, where we learn that Andrew, Peter's brother, was a disciple of John the Baptist who heard John's statements about Jesus' messianic purpose and took his brother to meet Jesus shortly after. In the Gospel of Luke, Jesus actually visits Peter's home and heals Peter's mother-in-law before asking him to become a disciple. So there are a few hints that the decision to follow Jesus was not quite as abrupt as the story is making it out to be. And there is some evidence that a group of young men following an itinerant preacher would not really have been all that unusual. Still, I can't say that I would have made the decision. While history and context can give us a clearer impression of the dynamics of the scene, it's still a large decision for Peter, Andrew, James, and John to follow Jesus here. Meanwhile, in the Shire, 17 years have passed since Bilbo Baggins' 111th birthday party that we discussed in our previous episode. Bilbo's young cousin, Frodo Baggins, had inherited his house in the Shire and enjoyed himself during that time, but he was beginning to feel a certain wanderlust in his spirit. Frodo was beginning to think that 50 might be a good age to begin his own travels, because Bilbo had left the Shire on his own adventure when he turned 50. As his 50th birthday drew near, Frodo received a visit from the wizard Gandalf, who had some difficult news to share. Along with his home, Bilbo had also left Frodo a small golden ring. It turns out that the ring was a dangerous item, the Master Ring of the evil Sauron, and with this ring Sauron could control the world. Frodo must now leave the Shire to protect his home from forces that seek to capture the ring for Sauron, and the small hobbit now faces the reality of leaving his home on a mission that he could not imagine. However, Gandalf warns Frodo that he should find some companions before he leaves. Quote, "But I don't think you need to go alone. Not if you know of anyone you can trust and who would be willing to go by your side, and that you would be willing to take into unknown perils. But if you look for a companion, be careful in the choosing." End quote. Fortunately for Frodo, someone was eavesdropping in this conversation with Gandalf about the ring, someone who changed the course of Middle-earth in later books. Sam Gamgee, Frodo's gardener, is picked up by Gandalf and pulled into the house by a window. A few moments later, Gandalf has volunteered Sam to join Frodo on his quest, and perhaps fulfill Sam's desire to finally meet elves. Sam and Frodo begin to plan a trip to Rivendell, where further decisions about what to do with the ring will take place. But the two have to be careful about slipping away from the Shire to prevent unwarranted attention on themselves. Frodo sells his beloved home, and he convinces the Shire that he is buying a small house on the edge of the Shire to lead a quieter life. He enlists a few friends to help him facilitate this faux move to ensure rumors don't spread that he is going abroad. Most importantly, Pippin Took and Merry Brandybuck. While Frodo, Sam, Merry, and Pippin are moving towards the edge of the Shire, they begin to be chased by a mysterious black rider on a black horse. The rider's ominous presence continues to haunt the hobbits, but they manage to make it to the home purchased to complete Frodo's ruse. At the home, Frodo plans on saying goodbye to Merry and Pippin, but he faces quite the surprise when it is revealed that Sam has been supplying Merry and Pippin with information about the upcoming journey out of the Shire. The duo also inform Frodo that he is not leaving without them in one of the most beautiful displays of friendship in literature. "But it does not appear that I can trust anyone," says Frodo. "It all depends on what you want," put in Merry. "You can trust us to stick to you through thick and thin, to the bitter end. And you can trust us to keep any secret of yours, closer than you can keep it yourself. But you cannot trust us to let you face troubles alone and go off without a word. We're your friends, Frodo. Anyway, there it is. We know most of what Gandalf has told you. We know a good deal about the ring. We are horribly afraid, but we are coming with you, or following you like hounds." Frodo's astonishment is continued when Merry reveals that he has already prepared everything for the group to leave. So a few days after reaching his 50th birthday, Frodo Baggins sets out on an adventure of his own that he never planned for. I think that is all we need to know about both of our stories today. I'll try to bring up any important details during our discussion, but I hope this background will help out if you needed a refresher on either story. With that being said, join me in Capernaum and Crick Hollow, and let's dive in. My sister is one of my best friends in the entire world. She knows what I am thinking nearly all the time, and she can sense my moods just by the look on my face. A certain closeness exists between siblings that is difficult to explain and impossible to replicate. Needless to say, if she appeared at my house and told me she had found the Messiah, then she could probably read in my expression that I thought she was crazy. I find it fascinating that when Jesus picked his first 4 followers, he landed on 2 sets of brothers. It's truly an odd move in a way. If you were gathering followers, then it would seem like you would want to find individuals that feel alone or distant from their family. If someone feels alone, then they are likely to be more devoted to a leader that is recreating that sense of unity. By picking a pair of brothers, Jesus is calling 2 people who likely have a close relationship and devotion to each other. He also runs the risk that if one brother makes the decision to leave, then the other is likely to follow suit. Not exactly a risk-averse approach if you are trying to build a religion. However, I think there are a few different reasons that Jesus chose the 4 as his first disciples that are echoed by the 3 hobbits that joined Frodo on his mission. The first reason is probably the most obvious. If you carefully look at the description of Jesus' call to the 4 disciples in each book, it is obvious that some sort of relationship existed between Jesus and these 4 men prior to the event. The Gospel of John shows us that Andrew was actually a follower of John the Baptist, and if you've listened to episode 4 of this podcast, then you will know that it is highly likely that Jesus spent a significant amount of time himself with John the Baptist following his baptism. The Gospel of Luke also tells us that Jesus visited the home of Peter, Andrew's brother, before calling the 2 to his ministry. It doesn't take too many dots to draw a connection between these events and a familiarity that likely existed between Jesus and Andrew and Peter. Less is known about the relationship between Jesus and James and John. Some scholars speculate that they too were followers of John the Baptist and met Jesus this way. Others think that Jesus would have been intimately familiar with all 4 disciples through some sort of schooling in the Galilee area, but we really can't know for sure. Whatever the reason, it is highly unlikely that the 4 simply dropped their lives to follow Christ. Rather, they are likely making a conscious choice to follow a man they already respected and believed. Of course, this makes a perfect analogy for our hobbits. Merry, Pippin, and Frodo are all cousins, and they have grown up together listening to Bilbo's stories of adventure. At one point in the text, the narrator even calls Merry and Pippin Frodo's special friends. The ease with which the 2 young hobbits decide to embark on a dangerous journey is a reflection of the close relationship they have. Similarly to Andrew and Peter, or James and John, Merry and Pippin have an even more intimate relationship with each other than they do with Frodo. It's fairly obvious that the 2 are brothers in all but name, as you read through the story. Like the disciples, then, I imagine they have a good deal of trust in one another, and will only follow if the other agrees. The closeness that exists between these brothers, whether biological or through friendship, is a source of comfort and confirmation in their individual decisions to follow into the unknown. I think the decision to bring family members into his inner circle also represents another element of Jesus' ministry. One source that I looked at mentioned how the word brother, which I interpreted at first glance as a remark about their biological kinship, can also serve as a symbol of the new family James, John, Peter, and Andrew enter as followers of Christ. The source's point is that the literary audience the Gospel of Mark is intended for would have understood that by following Jesus, And I might add by leaving the fathers also mentioned in these verses. These 4 disciples are building a new family built on Christian fellowship that transcends their earthly sibling relationship. The term, fishers of men, can be seen as an attempt to gather more and more members of this new family. So Jesus' call to them is to establish a heavenly family while they are still on earth. It's a bit of a pie in the sky thinking, but this interpretation really elevates the text beyond its straightforward meaning. By choosing family members, Jesus is implying that an individual's tie to him as the Messiah supersedes any earthly bond that exists. Merry and Pippin can compare and contrast to this pretty easily. In comparison, the two elevate the relationship between themselves and their relationship with Frodo beyond simply cousins. They become best friends, brothers, and heroes in a way that far transcends their biological status. Further, they journey across Middle-earth, where they frequently teach others about hobbits and build bonds through reminding others the joys of a simple life. Whether it is smoking a nice pipe in the midst of defeating a foe, telling jokes at the right arm of a king, or singing and dancing with elves, Merry and Pippin, in a way, spread the love and simplicity of hobbits in much the same way that Jesus' followers spread Christianity. In contrast, Frodo makes no call for the cousins to follow him. In fact, his intention is to leave them behind. Their devotion to Frodo before the journey is what makes them join in. Further, their decision to join Frodo is actually the opposite of being fishers of men. They are meant to help Frodo escape from the Shire without drawing suspicion. James, John, Peter, and Andrew's job is to draw attention to Christ and bring more followers to this heavenly family. And Merry and Pippin's job is to make sure that earthly cousin stays alive. I also think Jesus' decision to invite the sets of brothers represents his sincerity in approaching followers. As I mentioned earlier, it would be really easy to target people who feel alone or left out. And we do see Jesus spend time with lepers, widowed women, and individuals with physical disabilities throughout the telling of all 4 Gospels. But he doesn't take advantage of these types of vulnerable people. He chooses 4 brothers who appear to have stable incomes and families. Jesus is avoiding a toxic approach of asking followers with little money or social standing to follow him around, and he often sends those he heals back to their own communities. However, by choosing these 4 for his first disciples, he is suggesting that the appropriate time to embrace a migratory lifestyle of preaching is when you have the option to decide and want a fuller, more religious life. Merry and Pippin follow Frodo along in the same vein. While not quite in the same category as fishermen, the context clues of The Lord of the Rings imply that Merry and Pippin were members of the landed gentry in the Shire. They would have assisted their fathers in running their estates, but they probably would not have held the title of a job we would recognize today. Still, they leave behind comfortable positions as well as connected family to join Frodo. Just like the 4 disciples. It's not an easy observation when you read the book, but Frodo could have sought out more macho companions. He could have tried to buy bodyguards or experienced guides or whatever the equivalent is in Middle-earth. But he chooses instead to trust people who love him enough to leave behind the comforts of their lives. And while they certainly aren't disciples of Frodo, the decision made by Merry and Pippin isn't altogether that different from James, John, Peter, and Andrew. The decision made by Sam Gamgee to accompany Frodo isn't necessarily made wholly on his own. The wizard Gandalf tells Sam he is going to join Frodo in order to prevent Sam, a notorious gossip, from spreading news about Frodo's real intentions. However, I don't think they really would have made Sam join in on the trip if he didn't want to. Sam's relationship with Frodo is also different than the other hobbits. Sam works directly for Frodo as his gardener, and he frequently refers to Frodo as master, probably an attempt by Tolkien to recall classical social distinctions for a British audience. I think Sam and Frodo can be a lens for the relationship that exists between Jesus and his new disciples after they accept the call. A disciple is, by definition, not on the same level as a master or teacher. Over the series, Sam and Frodo's relationship becomes much closer to a true brotherhood than one based on social structures. I think the same thing happens in the Gospels. If you are one of Jesus' first 4 disciples, then you cannot imagine being on equal footing with the Messiah of the world. But over time, we begin to see the bond that develops between Jesus and the 4 men he has called away from their daily lives. Jesus eats with them, faces storms with them, walks long distances with them, and answers their questions throughout the rest of the Gospel of Mark's telling. if you lived in such close proximity to someone, it's only natural that you will develop a sense of community that transcends the normal society bonds. Sam is, in a way, a different type of reflection of the relationship Jesus has with his disciples. Tolkien's Four Hobbits are a great way to conceptualize the relationship Jesus had with his disciples and the relationship the disciples had within themselves. Merry and Pippin show us the familial bond that is elevated to a status closer than brotherhood through their trials. Their relationship with Frodo reveals all that the disciples left behind willingly to go on Jesus' grand adventure as well. And finally, Sam is an example of how friendship with even a master can transcend the typical social boundaries that hold us back. And just like Merry, Pippin, and Sam do with Frodo, the disciples will witness Jesus' growth from small person to savior of the world. I have fished many times in my life growing up in Alabama, but I can promise you that every time I cast out a fishing line, it was purely for pleasure. Today, fishing in most parts of America is seen as a very relaxing endeavor, and it is idolized in country music songs every day. But I can assure you that I have no interest in becoming a fisherman for money, even today. I definitely wouldn't want to work on a fishing boat in Galilee during the 1st century Common Era. The fishing industry in Galilee at that time would have been complicated. It's likely that fishing licenses were required to fish in the most prosperous areas, and the Herodian ruler of Galilee may have increased the price of a license significantly as one of his tools to make more money for his building projects. This is not to mention the tolls that may have been imposed when moving ships, the wood needed to actually build and repair ships, the materials needed to build nets, and the verses imply that a fishing family may have needed to hire laborers to help with the boats. All of these fees and costs add up, and most fishing families in Galilee would have earned just enough to get by. So you can imagine the stress this type of lifestyle might have had on James, John, Peter, and Andrew. Sure, they would have had a steady job working on fishing boats, but it's hardly the luxurious task we think of fishing today. I think this background also reveals the difficulty in a decision to leave the family to follow Jesus. You are leaving behind people who may rely on you for help just to stay afloat. Pun intended. This background gives us so much more of an understanding of the gospel story beyond the traditional reading that the disciples were simply captivated by the Messiah and left to follow him. There is really only one hobbit that can relate to this feeling. Sam Gamgee is a simple gardener, and he works alongside his father to tend the gardens of Bilbo and Frodo. Chapter 1 of The Fellowship of the Ring tells us that Sam is beginning to take on more and more of the responsibility now that his dad is, quote, growing old and stiff at the joints. I wouldn't say that Sam and his father are living on the razor-thin margins of a family in 1st century Galilee, but they certainly don't have the privilege exhibited by Frodo, Merry, and Pippin. Sam's decision to follow Frodo to Mordor is arguably the most intensive sacrifice made by any of the hobbits, and he frequently wonders about the state of his father on the journey and laments his inability to help him. There is little doubt of the close feeling that exists between Sam and his father. It is heart-wrenching in ways to watch him remember happy things from his father amidst the awfulness of Mordor. More than any other hobbit, Sam presents us with an opportunity to reflect on the decisions and lives of the first 4 disciples. Like Sam, the disciples are found working with their father. Like Sam, they leave their father on a trip across Judea. And, like Sam, the disciples represent the strength and intelligence of a group of workers that would have often been overlooked by the audience of Mark's gospel. And I think in this last statement, it reveals the real beauty of both the Lord of the Rings and the Gospel of Mark. Jesus opts to build his movement around fishermen from the local villages, rather than scholars or wealthy benefactors. He often uses imagery and metaphors that would have been familiar to them to explain his views, and even the term fishers of men is a tribute to the way he thinks about their potential impact. Jesus does not see the fishermen for what they can't do, but rather by what they are capable of. While impossible to discern in any real historical sense, Christians held oral traditions about what happened to the disciples after Jesus ascended to heaven. Peter traveled to Rome before being crucified, the equivalent of walking from the modern-day Gaza Strip to Italy. Andrew made it as far north as modern-day Russia, spreading the news of Christ. John traveled extensively throughout Greece and would write several letters that are incorporated into the New Testament today. James is reported to have visited Spain and some other parts of Western Europe. These fishermen traveled immense distances to spread the word of Christianity, and Sam Gamgee mirrors these travels as he walks to Mordor. Sam essentially crosses the world, like the disciples, and he meets noblemen, elvish women with beauty beyond compare, dwarves, and a creature that many would regard as below pity in Gollum. Like the disciples, he comes across people from all over the world, and his remarkable simplicity and sincerity makes its mark on all of them. Sam and the disciples are icons of what ordinary people can accomplish. While I think the social status of Sam and the disciples is being used by the authors, I think the purposes behind the mentions of their social status are different. For Sam, his inclusion in the story is a way to show how the heartbeat of British culture, and implicitly their empire, is the average workers who enjoy things like bright gardens and good food. Sam's dialect and phrases often strike others as strange in the best way, and he endears himself by simply being himself. When Frodo, a member of the landed gentry of the Shire, is unable to continue in his journey for a while, Sam takes up the ring and bears it for a time. He is in many ways a representation of lower-class country British people that Tolkien must have admired. I think the Gospel of Mark is using the class status of James, John, Peter, and Andrew differently. Jesus' decision to choose them for followers is meant to show the inclusion and prominence of the lower classes in this new religion. A fisherman can be the most important member of Christianity just as much as a king or soldier or any other person. This may be a reminder to the Gospel of Mark's audience that fishermen, not the wealthy or powerful, were Jesus' preferred companions. Rather than using their class status to show how fishermen are an essential part of Galilean life, their inclusion is a reminder of the remarkable egalitarianism that Christianity strives for, even if it has never really been attained. Jesus takes ordinary people and makes them fishers of men to build a family that encompasses every corner of society. The occupation of Sam and the disciples is one of my favorite details in both stories. It makes the characters come alive in a way that I never imagined, and it makes me appreciate some leisurely fishing time just a little bit more. My last discussion today is the setting of our stories. In Jesus' call to the disciples, this conversation with fishermen is happening by the Sea of Galilee. The lake, which is very much not a sea, is prominent in many of the gospel stories, and it is a place where Peter even walks on water. The water is a familiar place to Jesus and his disciples, and they cross the lake several times throughout his ministry. When Merry and Pippin join Sam and Frodo to officially unite the four hobbits of the quest, the four cross the Brandywine River right at the edge of the Shire. The narrator tells us, quote, Sam was the only member of the party who had not been over the river before. He had a strange feeling as the slow gurgling stream slipped by. His old life lay behind in the midst. Dark adventure lay in front. End quote. Other than a bit of heavy-handed foreshadowing, this scene can also be seen as quite a monumental moment in the life of Sam Gamgee, a crossing of water that will forever change his life. I don't think it is surprising that these moments when friends become a fellowship and fishermen become followers has a background of water. Water is often seen as a symbol of change, and I think Tolkien is also using it as a bit of a symbol for chaos as well. Water flows and ebbs and is in an almost continual state of transition. It is unsurprising, then, that these moments come with a backdrop of water. The river and the lake will themselves not change, but the lives and perspectives of our characters will never be the same when they view these bodies of water again. The characters are changing when we first encounter these waters in the text, and they will become symbols of how much has changed by the end of the story. I think we can even view the water in these stories as a symbolical baptism into a new person, because neither the disciples or Sam can be the same after this moment. However, I think these authors are, again, using these symbols for different purposes. For the Gospel of Mark, the Sea of Galilee will continue to be in the disciples' lives, but it is no longer the simple lake used for fishing. In this lake, the disciples will witness Jesus calm a storm, men walk on water, and giant crowds chase them to its edge. It can no longer be the same lake where they used to fish with their father, because they have seen miracles that no other person on earth could perform. I think the Gospel of Mark is revealing that followers of Christ will experience their environment in new and fantastic ways. But the disciples themselves are never very far from the lake's shores. The Sea of Galilee is as much a part of their journeys as it is a symbol for change. all of these amazing things are occurring in a lake that is old beyond measure. I think the Brandywine River is serving a different purpose for Sam. Sam will not encounter the Brandywine River again until he returns to the Shire after his adventures. He will traverse mountains, swamps, mines, and even larger rivers on his travels that will forever change him. He grows a sense of confidence and capability from these experiences that will make this trip across the Brandywine appear minuscule in comparison. Rather than being a part of the story like the Sea of Galilee, the river serves as a marking post for who Sam is now. A small gardener might have crossed the river in the first book of the series, but a determined man willing to take on any problem to restore peace crosses it in the final book of the series. Rather than being a central element of the story like the Sea of Galilee, the Brandywine River is a place to reflect on what is ahead and what is behind. I think the challenge to us by the authors is to find the bodies of water in our lives that mark our transitions. What have we crossed in our lives that has forever changed us? Where do we go to reflect on that change? Life is full of change, and it can be hard to take time to really think consciously about how much we have grown as a person. May we all find the waters that lead to a better life, and take the time to stare into the reflection of the people we have become. That is all we have for this week. This episode also wraps up our first, but definitely not last, comparison between The Lord of the Rings and the Bible. I had a really great time writing and recording today's episode, and if you are interested in learning more about Galilee, Capernaum, or anything else from today, then please stick around for the sources that I will mention after this conclusion. I am still sorting out a few different plans for next week's episode, but I am planning on discussing more women in literature, as we have been pretty male-specific thus far. Check out our Twitter for the announcement of what we will discuss, but I plan on bringing in a little bit more diversity into the discussions next. I want to thank you so much for listening, and if you enjoyed this little podcast, then please share us with others that are lovers of books, biblical comparisons, or anything in between. We are just starting out, so we need all the help we can to get the word out. Also, please check out our website at anchor.fm/booknerdinthebible, or find us on Twitter at booknerd_Bible. You can find the next episode of A Book Nerd in the Bible on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or GoodPods. Thanks again, and may the book nerd in you be blessed until we meet again. Biblical research is very difficult, and I could not have written this week's episode without some amazing sources, so I really hope you'll check out these articles. For more about the disciples, check out Fishers of Men, Footnotes on a Gospel Figure by Charles W. F. Smith in the Harvard Theological Review. The Call of the Four Disciples in John 1 by Amos B. Hewlin in the Journal of Biblical Literature. Simon Peter by Cecil Roth in the Harvard Theological Review. Characterization of Peter in the Gospel of Mark by W. S. Forster in Neo Testamentica. Matthew 4:18-22, A Matthean Discipleship, an Audience-Oriented Perspective by Warren Carter in the Catholic Bible Quarterly. The Calling of the Disciples by John W. Schonheit in the Sower Magazine. And Gospel, Immediately They Left Their Boats by Michael Simone in America Magazine. For more about Galilee and its fishing culture, read The Galilee Entry in Britannica Encyclopedia. A Portrait of Jesus' World, Galilee, from PBS Frontlines From Jesus to Christ series. Digging Through the Bible, Understanding Biblical People, Places, and Controversies Through Archaeology by Richard A. Freund. Instability in Jesus' Galilee, A Demographic Perspective by Jonathan L. Reed in the Journal of Biblical Literature. Fishing Economy in the Sea of Galilee by Alicia J. Batten on BibleOdyssey.com. A 2008 ebook published by the Biblical Archaeological Society titled The Galilee Jesus Knew. From that ebook, I recommend How Jewish Was Jesus' Galilee by Mark A. Chansey, Ports of Galilee, Modern Drought Reveals Harbors from Jesus' Time by Mendel Nunn, and Synagogue Where Jesus Preached Found at Capernaum by James F. Strange and Herschel Shanks. For more about The Lord of the Rings, obviously check out The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. Also, The Complete Tolkien Companion by J.E.A. Tyler, and The Lord of the Rings from the Modern Critical Interpretation series by Harold Bloom. Thank you so much for listening, And please feel free to reach out to me on Twitter or Anchor if you want to learn any more about these sources. I could not have written the episode today without them, and I promise you will learn more than you were ever prepared to know. Trust me. That is all for this week, though, so thanks again, and I hope you'll join us again in our next episode.